Welcome everybody to today's webinar on the topic of where are all the pancreas transplants. We have a great speaker for you today, and before we introduce him, I want to go over a couple of logistic items. I am Heidi Aguiar and I'm part of the Alliance team. So first of all, how to navigate our platform. For those of you who have not joined us before, we are recording this webinar and therefore all the lines will remain muted. However, if you have any questions at any point in time, you can pose them through the chat feature on the bottom left-hand corner. You can see a blue icon, and that's where you will type in your question. And you can do that at any point, but we will be holding the questions till the very end. Coming up on May 9th, we have our next webinar that's focused more on the donation side of things, and that will be on the topic of dissecting and discussing clinically complicated cases, and so registration is open for that. And then also for today's webinar, we are offering continuing education credits. We're offering 1 CEPC credit and then also 1.2 nursing contact hours courtesy of Iowa Donor Network. One thing is that for the nursing credits, you must claim them within 14 days. That's not business days, those are actual days. And for the CEPC credits, you do have 30 days. Now, many of you are listening in a group together today, so whoever received the link for this webinar, who registered, will be the one that will receive the email with the evaluation link. Please make sure to note everybody who's in your group so that you can forward that evaluation email to them so that everyone can claim their continuing education credits. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Our moderator is Dr. Randy Sung. He's a member of our Transplant webinar faculty, and then he's also a member of our Transplant Leadership Council. Dr. Sung is a surgical director of kidney and pancreas transplantation and also an associate professor of surgery at the University of Michigan Medical Center. So I'm going to turn it to Dr. Sung to moderate today's webinar.
Thanks, Eddie, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Fridell, who's giving today's webinar. He's a professor of surgery and the director of the Division of Abdominal Transplantation Surgery and the University School of Medicine. He's been on the faculty there since 2002, following his abdominal transplantation fellowship training at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Thomas E. Starzl Transplant Institute. He's also served as the director of the Pancreas Transplant Program at Indiana for most of his tenure, and under his leadership, this program has become one of the nation's busiest transplant centers. Having published and presented extensively on the topic of pancreas transplantation, Dr. Fridell is also an associate editor for the American Journal of Transplantation, a deputy editor for clinical transplantation, and he is the current chair of the Pancreas Transplant Committee for the United Network of Organ Sharing, or UNOS. So he is eminently qualified to tell us where all the pancreas transplants have gone. Dr. Fridell.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And our topic for today is where have all the pancreas transplants gone? I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you all. To start off with, I don't have any disclosures. I will be presenting data and grafts from the OPTN UNOS and from the International Pancreas Transplant Registry. Finally, I'm just a person. I'm presenting a lot of behavior in this talk. I believe in pancreas transplantation. I am very biased in favor of it. Pancreas transplantation in recent years has developed a little bit of a bad reputation. It's considered an operation with a high potential complication rate with great morbidity. The patients are sickly. They're all diabetic. They've been diabetic for a long time. There's a lot of vascular disease and amputations. There's a lot of patients that have visual impairment and blindness. A lot of problems with gastroparesis. Nausea and vomiting becomes an issue. Frequent readmissions. A lot of patients with chronic pain, narcotic dependency. My patients wanted you to know the pancreas transplantation can be transformative. And over here I have a group of my patients that all had their transplants and then went on to be very meaningful contributors and very happy with their lives. And you know, these are patients, when you come to transplant, you know, if you get a liver transplant, usually you're sick for a few years. For a kidney transplant, this might be many years, but for many of the patients that are getting a pancreas transplant, this has been a lifelong struggle, sometimes for decades. And one of my patients, actually, after his pancreas transplant, has gone on to become a marathon runner and a triathlete. So during this presentation, I'm going to define the problem. I'm going to describe some potential suggested reasons for why this is happening. And then at the end of this talk, I'm going to go over some solutions for how to make the situation better. On this slide, I show the United States pancreas transplant volumes over the years. This is data from the International Pancreas Transplant Registry. And what you see is that pancreas transplantation was a curiosity before the 1980s. And then, hang on one second. And then as we go, you see this rapid increase in the volume of pancreas transplants. And then somewhere around 2004, you see a reasonably precipitous drop in the number of transplants that are happening. So as of 2015, greater than 50,000 pancreas transplants were reported. Greater than 30,000 were from the U.S. Greater than 20,000 were from outside the U.S. The peak was at 1,484 pancreas transplants in 2004. And then since then, we've dropped to where in 2014 we were below 1,000. In 2015, we were almost exactly at 1,000. In the meantime, coinciding with this, outside of the United States, pancreas transplantation has been increasing. So this is really a United States-specific problem at the moment. When you look at pancreas transplants by categories, what you will see is that pancreas transplants initial growth was mostly simultaneous kidney and pancreas transplants. Somewhere in the 1990s, there was a change. You know, patients who get a pancreas after kidney usually get them after a living donor kidney transplant. In the late 90s, we introduced laparoscopic donor nephrectomy and started doing more living donor kidney transplants. And coinciding with that, you see a very steep increase in the number of pancreas after kidney transplants. And then in 2004, almost like a light switch, we decided that that wasn't good and we stopped doing those. And I'm going to go into a lot of detail about this decline in pancreas after kidney during my talk. And then pancreas transplant alone has always been the lowest volume. And actually in recent years, pancreas after kidney and pancreas transplant alone are almost the same. Now this is particularly curious because we have not seen poor outcomes that would explain this. So this is patient survival, and there's not been this drop in patient survival that would explain why suddenly we stopped doing pancreas transplants. And this is by category, so pancreas after kidney, pancreas transplant alone, and simultaneous kidney and pancreas. Although we've had a hard time explaining why pancreas transplant alone, the survival has decreased, I think some of it has to do with the indication for this type of operation. And when you look at one-year graft survival, that's actually improved with time, making it even more curious why this is the one case that I can think of where you have an operation where you've become more successful, but yet you're doing less of them. So why is there this decreasing trend in all the types of pancreas transplants? During this talk, this portion of the talk, I'm going to go through several things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the offers just not being as good as they used to be. I will discuss risk aversion. I will discuss the decrease in the referral base, and then I'll discuss how pancreas transplantation has achieved a low priority compared to other organs. So first of all, the offers are just not as good as they used to be. So you can see this is the number of donors that were recovered in the U.S. And again, you see the steep incline in the number of donors. Somewhere around 2006, we plateaued. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but 2006 is also when DonorNet was introduced. And then we're very proud of this, but in the last year, our numbers have increased again, and last year was a record year for organ donation. When you look at the number of pancreas transplants that were recovered, discarded, or transplanted, on one side you have the numbers, on the other side you have the percentage. So the purple line, which is the number of pancreases that were recovered, this purple line is going to be made up of this blue line, which is the ones that were transplanted, and this green line, which is the number that were discarded. And I think you can see that there's this big drop-off in the number that were recovered, and much more so than the other two. When you look at the percentage, the number of transplanted, sort of a gradual decline, but mostly it's the number that are recovered that has dropped precipitously. This slide shows you it's kind of a lot of information on a single slide, but basically we split up the number of donors based on their age category. What I wanted to show you in this slide is how the 50 to 60 and the 40 to 50, 45 and over, you start to be a little concerned about using a pancreas. a donor over 50 is a curiosity as a pancreas donor. It happens, but it has to be a pretty spectacular donor. So when you look at the increase in the number of donors, a lot of the increase was in this group of patients that was a little bit too old to transplant. And if you look at, I don't know if that went. If you look at BMI, the 25 to 30 is what we would consider sort of the ideal range. But you still see a pretty good increase in the number of heavier donors. This is the 30 to 35, and also an increase from almost nothing for the number of 35 to 40 donors. And BMI over 30 is a threshold where we change our allocation for the donors. Of all of that information, the most important of this series of slides is the reasonable pancreas donor numbers. So what we did, this was information that we got from the U.S. Pancreas Transplant Committee. We separated the donors into those that were reasonable as a pancreas donor and those were not. Reasonable, we considered age less than 35, BMI less than 30, not diabetic, a reasonable creatinine, not PHS high risk, and the most favorable 75% of the PDRI. That does not mean that the other donors would not be used for transplant, but these are sort of the ones you'd have a hard time figuring out why they wouldn't be used. And what you can see from this slide is that there's a nice and steady decline in this type of donor. I put up this slide just to show you a possible explanation for some of why this is happening. This is good news, but not very good news for young, healthy donors. This shows that the traumatic brain injury mortality, which is the green of all these, that we've actually done a really good job with traumatic brain injury, and the mortality from this injury has gone way down. On the other side of the slide, you see a bone flap, which is where they've basically opened up the cranium. They've taken off a flap of bone so that there's room for the brain swelling so it doesn't herniate. With things like this and other maneuvers, we've actually improved the survival for patients who have a traumatic brain injury, which was one of the major indications for young, healthy donors to become organ donors. So many of these patients don't make it to organ donation, which is wonderful for them. I'm not saying that's bad, but it certainly affects the number of young, healthy donors that we have. Next, I'm going to talk about risk aversion. This is my lunchtime slide. What I have here are 3 different bad outcomes for a pancreas transplant. This slide on the left is a picture of a pancreas that was transplanted and the splenic artery thrombosed. And you see this line of demarcation and the whole tail is necrotic. This pancreas was a venous thrombosis. It was removed. This is on the back bench. You see this clot down here is the clot that we took out of the portal vein. And this pancreas was an enteric leak. This is from the anastomosis. It's actually one of the stitches that we used to oversew the staple line that tore through a little bit. I showed you this slide so that I can now show you this slide and tell you that for this tail that thrombosed, we dissected the tail and left the head in. And this is a patient who has had a wonderful graft outcome. This patient had a thrombosis, but we retransplanted her the next day, and she's also done wonderfully. This patient was managed with a little patch repair of that leak and drainage, and he's also done very well. And you know, these are very bad complications, but you could still land solidly on your feet and have a nice outcome. When you look at early technical pancreas graft failures, early on in the history of pancreas transplantation, this is only one of the reasons why pancreas transplantation could easily never have happened if we hadn't persisted. Nowadays, the technical graft failure rate is down around 5%. That doesn't mean you don't have complications, but usually we can get through them and maintain the graft and the patient with a good outcome. Regulatory oversight has made some of these bad outcomes a concern for the surgeons doing the operation. You know, if you have a certain number of grafts that thrombose and you have to take them out, with the amount of oversight nowadays, you know, your program will be under investigation and closed and you won't be able to transplant anybody. It's become paramount that you transplant patients and have good outcomes. What that means is that many centers cherry pick, and it doesn't just mean that they don't do the aggressive, difficult to use grafts. It means that very often they'll make a decision sight unseen just based on the histories of the donor. Donors could have a lovely graft. You know, young, very heavy donors, BMI of 35, they can have a lovely pancreas. A patient who drinks a lot of alcohol might have a perfectly normal pancreas, but if you don't look at it, you'll never know. We've, for a very long time, had no definition for graft failure for pancreas. It comes as a surprise to many people. Clearly if you take out a pancreas, the graft has failed. And if you retransplant a patient, the graft has failed. Or if they expire, if they die, their graft is no longer working. Where it starts to get very confusing is a patient starts a little bit of insulin whether or not their graft has failed. Within the past year, the U.S. Pancreas Committee has actually put forward a definition for graft failure, which is going to go into policy. For that, we're going to be collecting data, and people are going to be supplying certain numbers that help us decide whether or not grafts have failed, and then we'll be able to look at it a little bit more objectively. The other point is that OPOs put all the risk on the transplant team. So, the way high risk works nowadays is the patient might be high risk, there's an obligation to get a consent, but on top of that, the OPOs have asked all the transplant centers to sign that they're aware that things are high risk and that they've signed away all the responsibility to their own center and not to the OPO. In terms of the waivers, many OPOs will not offer waivers for the pancreas. I understand if a pancreas is described as looking edematous and it gets to your program and it looks edematous and everything was described and it's as it was and you don't transplant it without any change of information. Where I struggle is when a pancreas is described as looking just lovely, and I'll show you some of these at the end of my talk. When it actually arrives there, it looks nothing like what it's described. There's a real reluctance to accept a pancreas to look at it unless you sort of have that opportunity to not pay for it. You're already paying usually for the airplanes and the flights and the transportation. Where we really struggle is, the obligation to trust someone you've never met to procure a pancreas for you. The other point is that you should know your limitations, and I think that the more transplants you do, the less your limitations are, and you realize there's a lot of things that people are very concerned about that are actually very acceptable in pancreas transplantation. In terms of the decreased referral base, on this slide, this is another one from the OPT and from the U.S. Pancreas Committee. What we looked at here is the number of transplants, which is the blue line. And we looked at the number of registrations and the number of additions to the wait list. And what you can see is that one of the reasons we're doing fewer transplants is because we're not evaluating and listing patients. They're not coming. They're not being referred. And this is particularly true for pancreas after kidney of the 3 different types. During the next little bit, I'm going to talk about pancreas after kidney compared to SPKs. I'm going to start off by showing you a slide from the International Pancreas Transplant Registry from 2004. I'm going back there because it really paints a picture for how we looked at pancreas after kidney transplantation. So what you see in this slide is pancreas graft survival in red for the SPKs. And then for yellow and green, you see the pancreas graft survival for pancreas after kidney and pancreas transplant alone. And important numbers to look at are the 1-year graft survival, which for SPK is 85%, and for the pancreas after kidney is 78%. And the interpretation that most people had from this is that if you transplant the kidney and the pancreas from the same donor, you will detect rejection by recognizing that the kidney is struggling. And then you do a biopsy of the kidney, and you'll treat rejection, and you'll save a subclinical rejection in the pancreas. Whereas if you do just a pancreas transplant, either as a pancreas transplant alone or as a pancreas after kidney, your ability to monitor the graft is much less because now you're relying exclusively on lipase levels, clinical picture, and usually a biopsy, but sometimes it's very difficult to biopsy a pancreas. Flash forward to 2015. What I'd like to point out on this slide is that pancreas after kidney is now halfway between the pancreas transplant alone and SPK. Our immunosuppression's improved. Our clinical interpretation of what the patients are doing and what the lipase means is improved. The pancreas after kidney 1-year graft survival is now 85.7%, which if you go back to our prior slide, is at least as good as the 1-year graft survival was for SPK in 2004. So our graft survival is improving. And for some immunosuppression protocols, we've eliminated any difference between the 3 types of transplants. And if you look at 1-year graft survivals, now all 3 of them are in the 90s. And if you look at 1-year pancreas graft survival, this is by year. So you'll see that as time is passing, SPKs have been reasonably stable, with very little improvement. Pancreas after kidney and pancreas transplant alone have been improving steadily over the years until they're catching up to the SPKs. Patient survival, 3 parallel lines. There is no difference in patient survival between the 3 types of transplants. And that is not exactly what we saw 10 years ago, but that is the current state of affairs. If you're going to remember one slide, if you're going to take a screenshot, this is the one. This is a study from the University of Wisconsin. This is looking back at 1,000 SPK transplants performed at a single center with 22-year follow-up. This was published in the Annals of Surgery in 2009. It's a wonderful reference, and one of the slides that they showed is patient survival. This is patient, not graft survival. This is patient survival. All of the patients on this graph are type 1 diabetics. This is survival on dialysis. So the patients that we're transplanting, waiting has a really high mortality. So when you take it out to 4 or 5 years, we're in the ballpark of 25% survival on dialysis. So it is fairly urgent that we get patients listed and transplanted. They should not linger on a list. If you do a deceased donor kidney transplant, a kidney transplant of any sort shows a survival advantage over being on the wait list. If you go from a deceased donor to a living donor, you now have this patient survival advantage. And now if you add a pancreas, now this is a program that for decades really focused on simultaneous kidney and pancreas transplantation. So most of what they did was SPKs, not PAKs. But if you do a kidney and a pancreas transplant, again you see a huge patient survival advantage. But it doesn't manifest immediately. It takes about 4 years to show that main difference. Again, my most important slide. So the patients that are coming with type 1 diabetes who are on dialysis or pending dialysis, they have a lot of options before them. But really the question should be, how can we do a pancreas and a kidney transplant for this patient? They need to get a kidney quickly. Ideally, they should get both organs. Now this is a publication from 2003, a year before the pancreas transplant volume tanked. This is a study that was published in JAMA. It was written in association with the OPTN from UNOS. And what they were looking at was the relative risk of death with pancreas transplantation. And they looked at SPKs, PAKs, and pancreas transplant alone. This is the dotted line in the sand that represents 1, which means there's no difference. Anything to the left favors transplantation. Anything on the right does not favor transplantation. So for example, for simultaneous kidney and pancreas, in the first 90 days, the first 3 months, because you had a big operation, it does not favor transplant. But once you get beyond 90 days, there's a strong statistical favoring for transplantation. When you look at pancreas after kidney, now again, this is the dotted line in the sand. In the first 30 days, does not favor transplant, but once you get beyond 30 days, there's no statistical difference because they crossed that one line. Again, it looks like it's towards the right, but it's statistically not significant. When they looked at overall, including all 3 groups, they found that there was a statistically significant higher risk of death with the transplant than without. And just to make sure you understand what that means, this is the waiting list for patients who are needing an SPK. And this waiting list is going to be one of the key points I'd like to make. This is the waiting list for a pancreas after kidney, and this is the waiting list for a pancreas transplant alone. Notice that the survival for all 3 groups, again, is a parallel line in this study as well. And also, please notice that the study does not go out beyond 4 years. This study has been rebutted several times. It was rebutted twice by Rainer and Angelica Grusner and David Sutherland, representing the International Pancreas Transplant Registry. It was rebutted as a letter to JAMA, the one that wrote the original article, and this rebuttal was in the American Journal of Transplantation. They pointed out some flaws in the data collection. They showed that there were subjects that were counted multiple times. 12% were counted more than once. 6% of pancreas transplants alone and 10% of SPKs got kidney alone, and they should have been recategorized. And most importantly, when they did the original study, they excluded patients that had a creatinine that was more than 2. And some of the pancreas after kidney patients got their living donor kidney transplant, were relisted for the pancreas after kidney, and got their pancreas before the creatinine was re-entered, and they were excluded because their creatinine was a pre-transplant creatinine. When they repeated the study, for pancreas after kidney, they showed a statistically significant advantage for pancreas after kidney beyond a year. And if you look at the overall, which includes that early period, they showed no statistically significant disadvantage. Their wait lists were similar to what was shown for the previous study. But remember, I showed you this slide before, and I'm going to remind you again that the inflection point for the survival advantage was actually at 4 years and beyond. And none of these studies went out beyond 4 years. I'm going to remind you that the patient survival was identical for all 3 types of transplants. Most importantly, this is looking at patients that are listed for a pancreas after kidney and comparing them to patients who got a pancreas after kidney. The reality is, when we see a patient, we're telling them that they need a kidney and they need a pancreas. We tell them that they have 2 possible choices. They can get a simultaneous kidney and pancreas, or if they have a living donor kidney, they can get a living donor kidney, which is what they really need, and they can get a pancreas after they get their kidney. So although both studies looked at this line here as the wait list for the pancreas after kidney, the reality is they should have been looking this as the wait list before getting a living donor kidney and then a pancreas after kidney, and achieving the exact same survival as you would with either an SPK or a pancreas after kidney. So we've been in the process of revisiting all of this data on the UNOS Pancreas Committee. Again, we found very similar results for the wait list survival. We took it out a little bit further. We're taking it out now to 10 years to see if that makes a difference. When you look at the patient survival for the 3 groups, again, all 3 groups have the exact same survival. When you look at kidney graft survival, this one's actually very exciting. The best kidney graft survival, which is what you're trying to achieve, was actually for the living donor pancreas after kidney combination. And when we looked at pancreas after kidney, comparing to the SPK wait list as opposed to the patients who received a living donor kidney, we actually found the most significant of all the differences for patient survival. So my point here is not necessarily that you have to switch your tactics, but pancreas after kidney is absolutely a good strategy for a patient who has a living donor. Not to mention that if they have a living donor, that's one more standard criteria donor kidney that goes back into the cadaveric kidney donor pool. And it's the best kidney graft survival that they can hope for. And really the priority here is you want to get the patient the best kidney allograft survival. Changing tacks a little bit, we're going to talk a bit about competing therapies. Many of these are labeled as cures for transplant for diabetes. The ones that I'm going to mention, some of them will go into more detail, but islet transplantation, diabetic management options and pump therapies, immunotherapy, gene therapy, stem cell therapy. Particularly islet cell transplants has improved steadily and it continues to improve, and I'm optimistic that at some point is going to surpass pancreas transplant alone as the optimal therapy for these patients, but currently does not yet have the survival or the longevity of a single pancreas transplant. And usually the outcomes we're looking for are very different for islet transplants and pancreas transplants. You know, we considered it a success if you do a single pancreas and they become independent of insulin. We do not consider it a success if they're on insulin but they're not having hypoglycemic events anymore. I think one of the things that's going to be very important now that there's a definition for graft failure for pancreas is to come up with similar ways of comparing the different types of therapies. The artificial or bionic pancreas, this is a glucometer and a pump that communicate with each other. Nowadays, the artificial or bionic pancreases are being developed. One of the big changes is that they've added glucagon to the pumps. One of the big problems with these pumps in the past has been that they do have a tendency towards hypoglycemia, which has been helped a lot by adding glucagon. But the indications for pancreas transplants right now would probably remain the same. If somebody needs a kidney transplant, then they might as well also get the pancreas and no longer be diabetic. But hopefully these types of strategies would eliminate the need for the kidney transplants in the first place. However, although not yet the perfect cure for all diabetic patients, many are publicizing this as a present cure for diabetes that would be applicable to all patients. Pancreas transplantation is not experimental. CMS approved SPK and pancreas after kidney in 1999 and also approved pancreas transplant alone in 2006. And despite the requirement for an abdominal surgical procedure and immunosuppression, this still remains the most reliable way to provide long-term glucose control in the diabetic patient with the appropriate indications. Finally, I'm going to talk about low priority. Well, that's unfortunate. I just lost my slideshow. Excuse me one second. Okay. In terms of low priority, I apologize for that. Since DonorNet became available, we changed the whole system from a person used to call you in the middle of the night and tell you about a pancreas donor, and you would discuss the donor, and you would have to tell someone directly that you had a reason that you didn't want to look at the pancreas. One of the things that's changed is DonorNet has made it very easy at 3 o'clock in the morning to look at an offer, not feel like doing it, and put in an 8:30, and nobody will ever know the difference. It's unfortunate, but by making it anonymous, you could put whatever you want in there. And unfortunately, sight unseen, without looking at any of the grafts, many centers have found reasons to turn down pancreases as opposed to good reasons to look at them. It's difficult to have a pancreas transplant program. Balancing priorities, balancing manpower. You come back with a liver and a kidney pancreas. It's very easy to just let go of one of the grafts and not have to deal with it. It's very labor intense. The patients are very sick. The operations are not straightforward. And the patients are difficult. Pancreas transplantation would be very easy if the patients weren't so diabetic. They have trouble with gastroparesis. They have trouble with orthostasis and autonomic neuropathy. They have difficulties with their bowels. And it really takes a lot of attention to get this right. Importing organs has become very complicated. Nowadays many programs are using charters as opposed to commercial flights to transport the organs. This can become very expensive, but it keeps the ischemic times much lower. You have to trust complete strangers sometimes to procure an organ, describe it to you, and send it to you. The timing is complicated. You want to make sure that you bring an organ to you very quickly and very efficiently, and you get it in quickly. Cross matches used to kill a lot of time. With local donors, you could do a cross match beforehand. With an imported organ, it's not so straightforward. It's become a lot easier now with virtual cross matches. Many centers will accept an import offer for a zero PRA patient, and will start their transplant based on the virtual cross match alone. And as I mentioned before, the topic of waivers is very complicated. The communication of what an organ looks like. One of the things that's made it much easier to import organs is that the digital communication has changed quite a bit. And it's now become possible. First, we were taking photographs on site. For a brief period, I was doing FaceTime or Skype with the people on site and looking at the organ live. If that's not possible, you could do a short little video showing the pancreas from different aspects, but seeing it moving makes it a lot easier to see what's going on. But you can get a lot more information nowadays about a pancreas, and the communication is good enough that the waiver situation should be very different. This is an important topic. The ASTS fellowship requirements are a sufficient volume of case material for the program. They have to do 20 pancreas transplants to be accredited, and then the fellows themselves have to participate in 15 pancreas transplants for their accreditation. So a program doing 20 pancreas transplants with 2 fellows is unlikely to be able to train 2 fellows to do pancreas transplants properly. In 2014 and 2013, there were less than 10 programs that performed 20 or more pancreas transplants in a year. What this means is that we are training very few individuals that can go out there and do pancreas transplants. But more importantly, we are training very few people who can go out there and properly procure a pancreas allograft, which means that when you're trusting somebody who's in training to pull a pancreas and send it to you across the country, it's very difficult to have faith that they're having good judgment, that they're doing everything properly, and they can describe things properly. I'm going to show you some misadventures that we've had. This is a pancreas that I imported that was described as a little vein that was ligated off of, or that was cut off of the portal vein. So over here you have the portal vein, and this is the splenic vein, which is half of the blood flow from the pancreas, which is completely transected off of the portal vein. This was misdescribed. Over here, this is a pancreas that was forked at the tail. It was really split right down the middle. This over here is a pancreas that was described as lovely. I don't think you have to do pancreas transplants to recognize how injured and bruised this pancreas is. Over here we're holding the mesentery, and all the way down through the mesentery, through the pancreas, and down toward the superior mesenteric artery was all bruised. And this is a pancreas where the whole head was cut open. I didn't include it, but I was sent one pancreas that had a cancer in it. What this means is we really owe it to the organ donors to make sure we put our best foot forward. And when I think of what we can do to really help pancreas transplantation, I would say that probably the paramount thing is we have to make sure that we send out really the most experienced person to go procure these organs. I think that a program that's procuring to send an organ to another center really should send out somebody who is experienced and knows what they're doing. I think OPOs have the ability to impact on this a little bit. They might want to insist on it if they want to have organs that are procured and sent and transplanted. They might want to insist that their transplant center send out a qualified person to pull out these organs. As the chair of the Pancreas Committee, just a couple of quick comments on projects that we're doing to try to make sure that we don't waste organs. There's currently qualifying criteria for kidney pancreas patients to be listed to get waiting time for kidney pancreas. One of those qualifying criteria is that the patients can't have a C-peptide that's over 2. That's reflecting how much insulin they're making, and also have a BMI over a certain threshold. And in the past few years, many centers have started doing type 2 diabetics fairly routinely, and there have been a number of publications that have said, I don't understand why there be this limitation. We have done this, and the patients do just as well as all the other patients. So currently we have a project that we're starting to look specifically at whether or not that's too restrictive on the number of pancreas transplants. We have another project we're working on right now where we look at ABO compatibility. So currently you have to do ABO identical to ABO identical. If there's a blood group A donor, it has to go into blood group A recipients. And recently we realized that there was a difference between the policy and the programming, where a couple of programs put Bs into ABs. And we realized that medically there's no reason that they can't be doing that. And we went back to the drawing board and said, why would we limit pancreas transplants from being done? In reality, most pancreas transplants with a kidney and a pancreas, happen from local donors. And most transplants nowadays are kidney and pancreas. So anything we can do to increase the number of kidney pancreas donors would increase the number of pancreas transplants we're doing overall. So what can we do? I think we can accept that pancreas transplantation is a very good thing and we can embrace it. And I would encourage people who are interested in pancreas transplantation that right now the landscape is ideal. There's not a lot of programs that are doing many pancreas transplants, and particularly pancreas after kidney transplants. I think we can accept the pancreas after kidney using a living donor kidney transplant from an individual's perspective and from a society perspective in terms of, using a living donor and putting another kidney back into the pool might actually be the best option for transplant. Alternatively, doing a simultaneous living donor kidney and a cadaveric pancreas transplant is probably the optimal way to do this. If we can accept that, really the best thing for somebody who's young and new at this field would be to go back to their program and look at the patients who've had a kidney transplant who probably should have been offered a pancreas transplant, and 5 or 10 years ago absolutely would have been offered a pancreas after kidney, and get them listed and start looking for a pancreas after kidney for these patients. It's an ideal time to do that. I think that we have to make sure that all the organs that can be transplanted go into a recipient. I think that strategies to increase local use of kidney pancreas transplants, I think making sure that organs are procured and handled properly would really help the situation. And finally, I think we should try very hard to decrease disincentives. I know that program-specific reports currently don't reflect the pancreas numbers because we don't have a definition for pancreas graft survival. But I think that there's this reluctance to take any type of chance. But when you look at these patients sitting on the list, they really have the highest mortality on the list. And I think that they would really want you to take any chance that you think you can safely do. So I would really encourage people to not hesitate to try to do what's right. And I think waivers should be handled delicately. I do think that waivers are reasonable when you get the feeling that somebody's just importing something so they can discard it. But I think that waivers, if ultimately something looks nothing like what it's described and you have pictures and evidence, I don't think that waivers should really be a thing anymore. And this last slide tells you that the pancreas transplants are all out there. There's plenty of grafts that are going unutilized. I think there's lots of opportunity to do pancreas transplants. I think we have to develop enthusiasm, refer patients, list patients, and look at organs and try to get people transplanted. And with that, I think I'm finished my last slide, and I'm ready to stop for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fridell. That was amazing. A lot of great information, and I already see some questions in the queue. But for those of you who are still trying to figure out where to put in your question, bottom left-hand corner, you can find a blue icon, and you click on that and type in your question. So while we have the Q&A time going on, as I mentioned earlier, many of you are listening in groups today. For those of you who are listening as a group, please complete this poll, and we'll leave that up for the duration of the Q&A time. So I will turn it to Dr. Sung to navigate the questions.
Well, thanks again, Jonathan. I echo Hetty's comments, some great information, and even more importantly, some really great insights as to what we can do about increasing pancreas transplant volumes. The first question I have is, what do you mean by retransplanted? This refers to, I think, the patient that you described. Did she have a different transplant, or did they do some kind of clot removal and place the same pancreas transplant back in?
I don't know if I can go back to my slides, or you want to keep this up right now.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep this?
Yeah, we could go back. I just will have to put the poll back up, new poll up. Hold on one second. Let me find it for you real quick. I'm just scrolling here through the slides. Sorry, there's a lot of slides. There it is.
There we go.
You got
Okay.
it.
So this is the slide that they're referring to, or actually I think it's rather this one. So the middle picture is the only patient that was retransplanted. The picture on the left, the one that shows the this, we just took off the tail. This one, we didn't take out the pancreas, we patched the hole. This one, the pancreas was removed and was not salvageable. This is a dead pancreas. It's probably been thrombosed for a while. The patient's sugars were elevated. We've written a manuscript on this topic where our philosophy is that we don't give patients any glucose in their IV fluids after their transplant. We watch the sugars very closely. We tend nowadays to ultrasound the patients in the operating room before we wake them up. That was an evolution where originally we were ultrasounding them on day one, but by then if they were going to clot off, they already clotted off. So we moved it to after transplant in the recovery room. And we realized that if there was a problem with the flow to the pancreas, that the patients, the OR nurses have already left, the anesthesiologist has already left, the patient's awake, the ultrasound is painful, then we have to whisk them back to the operating room. We wasted a lot of time. So nowadays we do a completion ultrasound once we're done with the transplant. And then we don't give them any glucose in their sugar water and their IV fluids. And then if their sugars go up, we take it very seriously. We either re-ultrasound or we go back to surgery. And with that, we've been able to salvage about a third of the grafts that are doing this. But the ones that you can't salvage, you have to take out. And one of the manuscripts we wrote was that if we take out the pancreas, we try to relist the people immediately. If they have a thrombosis and you've removed the graft, they're entitled to get back their waiting time. So usually they're right back at the top of your list. And if you can get another graft within the next week or two, since they're at the top of the list, you can go right back in there before there's any adhesions and get this graft put in a very easy field. If you let the patient completely heal, when you take them back several months later, it's more like a retransplant where you're going through a lot of scar tissue. It's a much harder transplant. So this patient had a second graft. We did not salvage this graft.
Great. You actually answered the follow-up question that I had. So the next question is there a lower age threshold or criteria for what would consider to be a reasonable pancreas donor?
So when we were doing that from the UNOS Pancreas Committee, we were trying to describe ideal. That doesn't mean usable. I think that most programs would look at donors up to the age of 40 or 45 without much hesitation. I think over 45, they have to be a pretty good donor. For years, I used to say that over 50, they had to die on the treadmill. And one of our OPO people called me up one day and they said they found the patient for me. They've got a donor. She's 52 years old. Her BMI was 39. She decided she had to lose weight. She got on the treadmill, had a heart attack, and became a donor. And then I qualified it to that they had to be on the treadmill and specifically training for a marathon. You know, all donors have multiple factors. Age is only one of them. You know, BMI is one of them. Their mechanism of death is one of them. The Pancreas Donor Risk Index took a stab at trying to take all of these factors and put them into a risk index so you could predict outcomes. but really nothing replaces experience at determining whether or not a graft is usable. One of the problems with our ideal donors is it misses a lot of unusable pancreases that get qualified as ideal donors. Because if you look at the BMI that we used, the creatinine that we used, the age that we used, the PHS high risk, that doesn't also include what if the patient died from a trauma and the pancreas was smushed, or if the patient had a splenectomy, or if they embolized the splenic artery for a bleeder. These would all be qualified as ideal donors, but yet you wouldn't use them because they have other reasons why they're not ideal. And that isn't captured when we say ideal donors, but the vast majority of ideal donors are going to be just that, ideal donors. I hope that answered the question.
It did. So one of the parts of the question was on the young side, on the younger age of this end of the spectrum, sort of what's the youngest end, and actually to tack on to what you were just talking about, I think it would be useful for the audience to know about what percentage of the time you turn down a pancreas in the OR because of what you find there.
So part one of that question is they're asking about the lower age threshold. When you start to get into the really young ones, we talk more about weight than we do about age. And I think many look at 20 kilos, but it's not absolute. There was a time when most young donors, we would do lollipop kidneys, and the age and size at which we will do the whole organ has changed. So the pancreas is very similar. The Achilles heel to a pediatric donor for the pancreas is the splenic artery usually gets very small, and at some point the size of the artery becomes prohibitive. So they are transplantable. I would say that they have to be procured by somebody who is familiar with procuring a pediatric pancreas, so that limits the applicability. So it's unusual for our program, for instance, to import a 25-kilo donor from across the country, but we might go out and look at that for a small recipient from a local donor. And the other half of your question was?
Right. So how often do you turn down, you talked about, how the ideal pancreas donor isn't always ideal because there are other things that, aren't necessarily known or incorporated into a pancreas donor risk index. So how often do you wind up turning pancreas down in the OR because of what you find during the recovery?
Well, I'll tell you, I think there's different sort of branching points. And I don't think the OPOs are going to like when I say this, but one branching point is, do you bother to look at a pancreas? And I think that that's a very important turning point because there's two philosophies, like why waste your time for something that's unlikely to look good, as opposed to, well, we should look at everything in case it might look good. And then the second branching point is, okay, you've decided that you're willing to look at it, then you have to hear what it looks like and decide what you're going to do with it. And I would say that sometimes you can guess that it's not going to look okay, but it might look okay, and you go to the OR knowing that. And sometimes you expect it to look perfect, and it doesn't. We had one of these ideal donors here maybe 3 weeks ago where we actually had the patient here all ready to go. I usually give the nurses an idea of what I think the odds are that this will be good, and this is going to be good. There's no chance this won't be good. And it was amazing how this pancreas was completely fatty infiltrated for a young, lean, healthy, perfect donor. You can never tell what they're going to look like. If they don't look good, you can't do the transplant. But I think this whole idea of looking at this ideal donor is, if you stack everything in favor of it looking good, yeah, some of them are going to be damaged, but these are going to be physiologically ideal-looking pancreases. Some of them are going to still be firm, some are going to have pancreatitis, some are going to be injured, but much more likely that they're going to be good than the ones that are BMI that are very high, age that's very advanced, somebody who's had, intracranial accident as their, like a cerebrovascular accident as their cause of death because of its association with vascular disease, etc. So we would expect that the majority of these would look good, but some of them are still not going to be good. If they don't look good, you just don't transplant them. You can't transplant them.
Yeah. All right, great. So this is a comment and a question. Looks like it's from the OPO side. We do not have transplant centers sign the high-risk forms. We think they have no value. We offer waivers on regional and national pancreas offers and will give local backup on the kidney. We encourage the team to come recover themselves, harder to turn down an OR based on visual than over the phone 200 miles away. If they cannot recover, we will have local credentialed surgeon recover, offer PICs, call from OR, etc. What can we do to encourage more regional and national interest? Centers are reluctant to seriously consider the offer until the OR. They should take blood pre-recovery, commit to checking recipient, and get some skin in the game.
I would say probably the best thing you could do is ask a question like that. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that there will be different philosophies from different OPOs. There have certainly been some OPOs that have really stepped up to try to get pancreas allografts placed. There is no requirement to send a kidney with a pancreas to regional and national offers. I think OPOs that do that for a program that is interested in taking the pancreas, I think that's kudos to them. I think that's a wonderful thing. There will be some that disagree with me, and there will be some that strongly agree with me. Very controversial area. But I will say that the waiver philosophy, I think the waiver philosophy should be more of a sportsman's agreement that, if you agree to accept it and you commit enough that you're willing to send an airplane and you're willing to get up in the middle of the night and go and look at the thing, and there is something that was critically wrong that was not communicated, I think most OPOs would understand that. Most of the time there's, oops, wasn't expected sort of surprised. What I'm bothered by is how many will make a big fuss about, if you take it, there's no waivers. Well, of course there's no waivers, but if it was misrepresented, I'm not sure if that's a waiver. So I really like the idea if you're willing to take it on no waivers, take it with local backup, do whatever you can to try to get this organ into a person, because I think that's the type of collaborative, cooperative type of approach that we should have to transplant in general.
Okay, great. Next question is, what are your upper limits for cold ischemic time?
It depends on the quality of the donor, depends on how it was flushed, what it was flushed with. I imported organs from across the country. It's unusual that we go over 12 hours of ischemic time. That doesn't mean that we would not, but it means that it's unusual for us to go over 12 hours of ischemic time. I think we start to get nervous after 12 hours. I don't know if that's based on any good evidence. Many programs for years have been doing 18 hours of ischemic time, 24 hours of ischemic time. But I'm one of those believers that has a lot to do with reperfusion injury, so we've been reluctant to do that. And frankly, I think that we get most people transplanted and keep our lists reasonably short without taking that risk. That's particularly a problem with the perfect graft. Nothing's changed, but we look at it, we don't like it, we decide not to do it. What do you do with that organ? I would say, we've changed the approach to the accelerated allocation. Accelerated allocation is now accessible to both the donor call center and to the OPOs. So OPOs can go through the list to the centers that have the little parentheses around them and try to accelerate the placement. In order to be on that list, you used to just say, hey, I'd like to be on that list, and boom, you were on the list. And so programs that didn't do any pancreas transplants could be on the list for expedited. Now you have to qualify to be expedited. And the qualification is you have to have done a certain number of imported pancreas grafts in order to show that you're serious about importing a pancreas graft. And now you're going to the serious programs, and I would say that the best thing you could do is call as soon as you know that you've got a problem with a perfect graft.
Okay, related question that's come up. Is there anything on the horizon to extend the survival time of the pancreas?
I wish I could ask a clarifying question. Do you mean of the graft survival, or do you mean the amount of time the pancreas is outside the body?
It was tagged onto a cold ischemic time question, so I think, sorry to be not clear, I think it has to do with preservation.
Difficult question to answer. I would not be surprised if we started talking seriously about pump preservation for the pancreas at some point. I know that kidneys, that's become standard in many centers, used for the extended criteria in other centers. It's become a huge area for lung transplantation. It's an evolving area for liver transplantation. And I would imagine it's not long until we start talking about it for the pancreas. Right now, I feel like with short ischemic times, we're doing okay. So currently I think hustling is working, but I would be surprised if we didn't start talking about pump preservation in the near future.
Okay, great. Right, because all the other organs are. So we have about 6 minutes. I'm going to start combining related questions so we can get them all in. The two questions, one is, do you have a minimum GFR for pancreas alone? And the other, which is kind of related, is how much time can there be between the kidney transplant and the PAK transplant?
We don't have a minimum GFR, but we sort of decide on a case-by-case basis. The issue for pancreas transplant alone, for those who don't quite understand why we're asking that question, is after you get a pancreas transplant alone, you go on immunosuppression medications that can be nephrotoxic. Kidney after pancreas transplant is sort of a growing population of recipients. We don't have a specific minimum GFR. I suppose it would probably be somewhere between 40 and 50. We would look at whether or not there's proteinuria. But that's sort of the ballpark. I would be very interested in the future of looking at patients who, are really dying of their diabetes and need a pancreas transplant alone. That really wasn't the focus of the talk here, but those are the types of patients who get pancreas transplant alone. And looking at some of them that have a GFR that's slightly higher than the 20 that's marked here for qualifying for kidney waiting time, and seeing if we can't do sort of like what we're doing with the liver transplants, with have some kind of escape clause if they get in trouble with their kidney. The other thought for this group of patients is if you have someone who's got a GFR that's just above 20, you can list them. They won't get waiting time, but if you ever get down to the bottom of your waiting list, SPKs still go above all other kidney transplants. They could still get transplanted if they almost qualify for waiting time. They could usually get a living donor kidney transplant too if they're just above that 20 threshold, if they're like 22, 23. And then you could do a pancreas after kidney. And the other question was?
Do you have any time interval limit between a kidney and a transplant and a PAK?
Yeah, fabulous question. Ideally, you could do them at the same time if you have the ability to do that. A simultaneous living donor kidney and pancreas transplant is what I would do if we were able to do that, but almost all of our pancreas transplants happen in the middle of the night at the same time as at least one liver, and doing a living donor at the same time as that would be very difficult to do. But if you are able to do that, that is absolutely probably the best way to do this. Otherwise, we tried doing it as quickly as we could after the living donor kidney transplant because we thought that way maybe we could do just one induction for the immunosuppression. The reality is that's just too much for the patients. They do not tolerate that. Currently, we wait at least 3 months after the kidney transplant just to let them recover. Our kidney surgeons would like to let us wait a year because they don't want to have a bad outcome from a pancreas transplant affect their kidney graft or kidney patient's survival for the living donor program. But the problem there is we really want to get that pancreas in to protect that new kidney graft. So I'd say 3 months.
Any top limit? Say you had somebody who's 10 years out from a kidney.
That's how we started our pancreas after kidney program, was we called people who were told they were too old or too fat to get a pancreas transplant a decade earlier, and then we called them all back in, we looked at them, and we knew our limitations. Our limitations changed, so 10 years later they qualified for a pancreas after kidney. Currently we're transplanting. Yesterday we transplanted a 65-year-old. We've listed a patient in their 70s. I mean, if they look good, feel good physiologically, that's what we look at more than the chronologic age. That wasn't what you asked, but anyway. What
strategies have you used to increase referrals from the endocrine community for pancreas alone transplants?
Outreach, grand rounds. We've done a lot of local grand rounds. Several years ago, they had a journal club for all the endocrinologists in our city. I presented there. It's hard to reach that community, though, because I think generally speaking, they're still optimistic something better is coming along immediately down the horizon. But the reality is that we capture the patients who are coming for a kidney transplant who are type 1 diabetics. So the vast majority of the transplants we're doing are coming from the nephrology community. Really, ideally, it'd be better if we got preemptive transplants and if they were referring the patients before they need to start dialysis.
Yep.
I answered the age range question.
Yep. What are your thoughts about PHS increased risk donors?
I think that PHS high-risk donors are different categories of patients. I think there's certain high-risk patients I don't hesitate. I tell my patients that they won't get a high-risk donor without being told that it's high risk and without them authorizing it, and then I tell them specifically what the high-risk criteria is. I'm usually very, very quick to offer patients who are hemodiluted with no social risk. I'm very quick to offer homosexual, particularly monogamous homosexuals, patients who did not behave in high-risk ways within the last few weeks, although they had high-risk behaviors a year ago. I basically work with the patients and try to decide what they would be comfortable with.
Yep, great. All right, last question. Any donor management suggestions that would improve the pancreas offers and utilization?
I think that I don't have a good 1-minute one. I think currently donor management, I don't water overload the patients. I think the lung patients say the same thing. And don't dry them up too much because that'll be bad for the kidney. I think it's very hard to skirt that perfect line between the two. I think hemoglobin A1Cs have been useful. Gosh, I really wish back when we were talking about what would be useful, I said C-peptides instead of hemoglobin A1Cs. But generally speaking, I think if we don't look at the grafts, we'll never know. I think that the real onus is that people have to go out there and look at the donors. And, I do think donors are taking a very long time right now. I think moving things along would be good for people. I don't think the pancreas likes waiting 2 extra days. I think many of them develop edema and firmness that they wouldn't otherwise develop. I'll stop there.
Great, fantastic. Really terrific question and answers. Hetty, do we have anything else?
Yes, at this point, I want to thank Dr. Fridell and Dr. Sung for an outstanding webinar, for all of your coordination, Randy, and also Dr. Fridell for just a wonderful presentation, and to the audience for your great questions. I think it's been a fantastic webinar and truly appreciate everybody's participation. For all the participants, we wish you a wonderful day. For the speakers, I'll move us back into the speaker room, and until next time.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.